Thank you, Director Easterly. We wish you all the success in the world at CISA. Next up, we have another timely conversation. This one is between emergency response leaders to share best practices for information distribution during crisis. As we've seen, when a disaster strikes, time is of the essence for businesses. And during times of crisis, knowing the status and the needs of the businesses is really key to setting response priorities, and having a direct line to government agencies who can also provide relief is so critical. And before we jump to the panel, I just wanted to share a great example of info sharing. I'm joined by Jim Morantz. He is the CEO of Sabre. For those of you who are not familiar with Sabre, Sabre stands for Single Automated Business Exchange for Reporting. It's a free tool that gives local, state, and federal agencies 24/7 access to a business's situational awareness, their data as they disclose it, so they can be prioritized and expedited for relief operations. And as each year seems to bring increased frequency and broadening ranges of different types of disasters, this tool is more important than ever. And this is only one example, but it's an important one. Sabre has over 130,000 businesses on its platform of all sizes and across industries. This enhanced collaboration between the private and public sector can have a huge impact on building back a community after a disaster event, especially for businesses that support lifelines of food, fuel, pharmacy, or retail. And I'm also reminded of former Administrator Fugate's saying that a business is not ever truly recovered until there's a resumption of commerce. Given the foundation's longstanding work in disaster recovery and supporting businesses in their resiliency efforts, we're excited to share that the leadership of the Chamber Foundation and Sabre intend to transition Sabre to the U.S. Chamber Foundation's Corporate Citizenship Center by the end of the year. More news on that soon. On to the panel. This afternoon, we're going to talk more about collaborative information sharing, and we're going to be joined by, Jim and I will be joined by other speakers, including Ben Rober, Preparedness and Protection Branch Chief for the Idaho Office of Emergency Management, and Bridger McGraw, Director of Global Security and Services at Athena Health. So, if we're ready, let's get to some questions. First one to you, Bridger. So, during typical crises, we know the lines of communications inside of different companies. There's usually the same executives, the same teams, but COVID was different. Can you explain to us how inside of Athena you had to broaden your communication circle? Who is included, and the types of tactics you use to make it successful?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and to the Chamber, DHS, FEMA, and Northern Command for hosting this event, as well as all the partners here on the call today. When the pandemic started, first, I'd like to congratulate all of us who leveraged the incident command system. And it may be a challenge for private sector entities to think about it inside their own organizations. But when it comes down to it, creating the conditions, assessing the actions you need to take, and recognizing the needs that your organization is faced with, that incident command system became a critical element of our response at Athena Health. So in my time there, we've used it internally to bring together all of the partners inside each of our business units, but mainly looking at the non-traditional ones: human resources, legal and compliance, our business continuity functions, and our communications teams. By bringing them in early and showing them the value of creating a unified team, regardless of the size, scale, and severity of an incident, that really helped us when the pandemic hit. That internal, by building the trust internally through repeated partnerships against smaller activities, by the time I had to bring them very challenging news that our 6,000 employees globally were going to be impacted by this, the trust is already established internally. And the incident command system actually played a very important role in us scaling this to be able to operate internally and share information very rapidly with our executives in the early parts of the pandemic, but also to sustain operations over the last 18 months. So I really commend the partnership to actually look internally at your organizations for how ICS might be of use.
So Bridger, a follow-up question to that is, if ICS is working so well now inside of Athena, how do you export that? And how do you bring in other partners, whether they be in the private sector or
Sure.
state and local government?
Yeah, I really look at information sharing. It's interesting. All of the panelists have sort of across the summit here have talked about information sharing in different ways. We've looked at it from the counterterrorism and the actionable intelligence in that space, along with Bob Klasky talking about strategic risk and how do we share information in that space. This is really about how do you take your trusted partnerships. Each of us on this call today has to recognize that we're trading trust with each other. I leveraged, my time at Homeland Security before I joined athenahealth helped me understand that I was going to need trusted information from HHS and CDC, from other companies of like size, scale, and even the sector from athenahealth, and that those were the types of questions that our executives would be asking. What are our peers doing? What are other technology companies doing? Where is the health sector across the country? How are they approaching this? And by having those external partnerships and those conduits in place, you need them to actually get your internal partners who might be changing, right? There's a lot of turnover, and you have to be mindful of that. But by being able to trade on the trusted information coming into your organization allowed me to push that information very rapidly to our executives and allow them on a repeated basis to evaluate it for our company. And that's where I think I see, again, the external partnerships, that information allows you to build trust with your internal partners that you can find answers to them rapidly. And likely, actually, you're going to save lives, save money, and hopefully help your sector by sharing how it worked. And that's where sector partnerships with HHS really, bore a lot of fruit for our sector, I think, throughout this pandemic.
Thank you, Bridger, for that perspective. Ben, next question to you. So during a crisis, borders don't really matter to companies, but they sure do to state and local government. Can you talk us through how Idaho dealt with this issue during COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. You brought us a great point that a lot of the feedback that we were getting from the private sector was simply just navigating through the different requirements or restrictions that each jurisdiction has, even within the state, let alone a region or across the nation. And so what we did in Idaho was really trying to leverage the technology that we had available and understanding what the private sector needed to in order to make timely decisions and capturing that in real time so that we could display that through them, utilizing our Esri products and dashboards and getting them the proper logins. But we also then had to understand what it is that the private sector needed to have in order to make those timely decisions. We knew or learned very early on as we were dealing with whether it was early run through the food producers and grocery stores for consumables, that within that first couple hours, businesses need to make decisions that are often very difficult to undo. And so they have to have accurate information right from the get-go. That changed a little bit of our philosophy and the data that we were collecting. How are we sharing it? And oftentimes, especially early on in a pandemic where information was changing so rapidly, changing our mindset of oftentimes we would want to confirm that information was accurate, and we didn't always have enough ample time to spend validating information, that we had to give the best information at the given time and relay that out. And we found with providing them that information easily obtained and that they can consume, that we in turn from a state perspective were getting either better questions or better report outs from the private sector that we could then use in turn for some of our operational decisions within the EOC. And we found that partnership to really grow as we built that trust and that communication avenue that really truly we want to now sustain through the remainder of the pandemic and into the future for other incidents.
So Ben, following up on that and how you did it and the timeliness of it, did you establish a certain rhythm or cadence other than just get it out there as soon as you felt it was validated enough?
Yeah, I think that was the traditionally we would have an established cadence within an emergency operations center. You know, we following, you know, Bridger had kind of talked about some of the ICS principles that you establish that that rhythm of when reports come out. With the pandemic, things were happening so quickly and changing, whether it's, you know, mask ordinances or updates or restrictions that jurisdictions were putting into place. We've really found the need to have real-time reporting and utilizing technology to help us get that data and have that be live, if you will, 24/7, 365, because we couldn't afford to wait until the next day to brief that out. We needed to put that information out as soon as possible.
Yeah, and thank you, Ben, for that. And it kind of brings me to our next question, and this one's over to you, Jim. And everything that Bridger and Ben just talked about really feels heavily manual, right? Not just for the first time you do it, but for every time you do it. So walk us through a little bit about what Sabre and other technologies like Sabre can actually help expedite the transfer of information and why it's so important.
Sure, and before I do that, just want to express our enthusiasm for joining in with the Chamber Foundation in the coming year to make this even more successful. And a lot of that success is based not just on the technologies themselves, but on the trust and sustainability that the technologies help to provide for the public-private partnership. Now, what our technology does, and our whole reason for being, is to help influence government decisions so that businesses can stay open longer and reopen faster in a disaster. So to do that, we gather the business status and needs from companies in a disaster area, and then share them freely with governments in multiple different formats. So there's really no reason why a government can't take that information, no matter what type of a application it's using. And when this works, businesses keep making money, they keep their employees working, and the community's needs are filled. And on the flip side, government stops spending money to fill gaps by what they might mistakenly think are closed businesses, which sometimes end up with a competition occurring between government and business to provide goods to the community. So from a technical standpoint, it's virtually any way that a company can provide information to us, from a spreadsheet to a mobile app to an automated connection, gets normalized inside of Sabre and then published out freely. And that's where it's better than 30 some states now, and all the FEMA organizations and DOD and quite a few other federal agencies then gather that information and view it in what they're already using. And Sabre doesn't want to be another thing that you have to go look at. It wants to be part. So Sabre's data, and that data goes into whatever application the organization is using.
Thank you, Jim. So it's one of these things where programs like Sabre, platforms like Sabre, are only going to work if enough people use them, if enough businesses log on. And there's always a resistance from some people in some sectors that say they're asked to share too much. And this kind of goes back to, you know, ESFs, and it kind of goes back to the EOCs, where oftentimes regulators are sitting there next to emergency managers, or sometimes it's the same person wearing two hats. And companies don't want to disclose too much for fear that they will be taken to task after the fact. So Ben, I mean, sitting in the state of EOC, how do you mitigate that? How do you explain to companies that this is what they need to do, and they're not going to be penalized for being part of the solution in emergency response?
Yeah, I think we've seen multiple examples of that, of some reluctancy to share information for that exact reason, of fear of that that regulator then taking that information during a disaster or an emergency situation, and then utilizing that. And I think I go back to that point of what we're really striving for, and it's not just Idaho. I think emergency management across the nation is consistently trying to build that relationship in blue sky. So those everyday events where we can build that trust and build that relationship, so that we have those connections already built. Going back to some of those ICS principles that Bridget was talking about earlier, building those connections ahead of an event and knowing who you're going to be talking to, and how things are going to be coordinated. If you can do that before an emergency, you're going to be well ahead in speeding up recovery, and even in your response phase, if you can build that trust early on. And so I think that's why we've really tried to focus on, through our consortium with multiple states within our region, working and reaching out to the private sector during the normal times, non-disaster times, so that we can establish that relationship. And there's that familiarity between what they need versus what a state or local government needs, and how we can complement each other's efforts without that fear of their feet being held to the fire by a regulator after the fact.
And Bridget, to you, I mean, Athena has 6 sites across the U.S. I mean, how do you share this real-time info, not just across your enterprise, but with your partners?
Yeah, I built a global security operations center for Athena, so I knew that like our partners at FEMA with the National Business Emergency Operations Center, I wanted all the information to be available to decision makers in one place. So inside the company, they had one place to get answers, or at least submit requests for information. I will say it was very hard at the beginning, right? We were all racing around trying to learn as fast as we could from, the state of Washington, and their experience first. And then as the pandemic spread, I think what's interesting from my vantage point is that as I found the report that worked, so once the Massachusetts Emergency Management Center agencies set up their reporting, it became easier to request that kind of reporting from other states, because you could show them a report and say, hey, do you guys have something like this? Oh yeah, we have that. And it immediately showed, maybe new folks or whoever the watchstander was, that other states were doing something and providing that to the private sector in a normalized way. And sort of that demystifies that regulator issue. I would also like to just commend the Health and Human Services sector. They held a lot more meetings than maybe our sector partnership really did, and they broke down a number of working groups to work on real deliverables, like a return to office guide, but some concrete items early in the pandemic that I think really helped other industries, see that there was going to be a path forward. So even in dark times, I think it's really important for us to find ways to work on the positive outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And that brings the regulators in, makes them part of the solution, and focuses us on getting out of the crisis. And I think that's really paid dividends over the last 18 months, because obviously we're not out of this. And honestly, with 6 different sites and 6 different, levels of transmission of the pandemic of COVID right now and the variant, I think it's still important for us to like look at each other and in our sector partnerships and make sure we're all doing all right and sort of share some of that and that information sharing itself is a good mental health way to support each other as we get through this.
Couldn't agree more, Bridger. All right, gentlemen, we have less than a minute left. How about 20 to 30 seconds each? Best advice you can give to the audience. Jim.
It costs nothing to join SABRE, and SABRE's combination of all the data about simple open close, and then more complicated after that. But your simple open close information is enormously useful to government. So join SABRE, share that information, and you will get benefits.
Okay, we'll make a commercial out of that later. Ben, to you, last words.
Yeah, I think we've said it a few times now, but reach out to those state EOCs and ask for that information. A lot of times we don't know what we don't know, and establishing that communication, telling us what the private sector needs or what the information you're looking for to help speed that up. Reach out, talk to us, and establish those connections early and often.
Right. All right, Bridger, you've got the last word.
It's never too late to start. It's never too late to start a new partnership. So if you haven't done this yet and you're looking for a way to start, reach out to any of the people attending this summit, and you will find a huge plethora of new partners to help.
And that's all the time we have. Gentlemen, thank you for your service in protecting our country. We'll turn it back to the program.